It's Mark and Pete.
Hello, and welcome to the show, Colourful Conversations with Mark and Pete. Each week, we tackle subjects on religion, politics, and business. On this week's programme, we're going to ask a simple question. Is the taxman the devil in disguise? Well, tax is a financial charge or a levy imposed upon a taxpayer. Now, of course, that could be an individual or even a legal entity like a company. And essentially, it's an equivalent of a state to fund various public expenditures. Now, of course, failure to pay tax or evade tax is a criminal offence and is punishable by law. Not everyone wants to pay tax, but they do realise the benefits. In recent times, the media, of course, has actually been focused on a lot of corporate multinational companies, whether that's in the UK or even in the US, who have moved their tax bases outside of their country, essentially, to escape high tax rates. Now, is this actually a good thing? Is this actually the work of the devil? Well, let's ask clergyman Pete. So, Pete, on this key topic, do you think that tax is the work of the devil?
Well, in that they're not very nice, I think that they can be regarded as devilish, but seriously, are they actually something in themselves evil? Are taxes wrong and there's nothing to do to redeem them? I don't think so. I think that if you look at how societies have been organised going back in history, we can see that many of them have had forms of taxation. Now, if you take the Old Testament Jewish nation, when they were asked to give in money, it seems that they were asked to give money and that they weren't necessarily forced. Certainly there's no sign of that within Israel. But they lived in a situation during Jesus' time and at other times when they were being held by a foreign power and they were being taxed, and the money was taken to give to whatever that particular nation, when they were under Roman rule, whatever the Romans wanted. So that in that situation, the taxation taken, they had no say or idea about what it was being used for. The other form of taxation, whether or not it was actually enforced in any way, was being taken by people who they acknowledged as their leaders and used for things that they could see happening. So there's two forms of taxation we're talking about here. That's taxation decided from on high or from far away. That sort of taxation never works. That sort of taxation reduces social cohesion, causes unrest, makes people unhappy. They don't want to pay their taxes, and you get lots of tax avoidance. Taxation which is levied close to the point of decision making and close to where the people are actually paying the taxes so they can see what it's spent on. That can be good taxation and simply help to have all the programs that you want to go on in society to be properly funded. So I say there's two forms of taxation. When it's levied by a distant power, distance in terms of geography and in terms of social strata, bad thing. I think that is from the devil because it causes so much unrest and heated feeling and has caused wars in the past.
Yes.
Whereas the form of taxation where it's taken, the decisions are taken locally and the taxes are taken locally so that people can see how they're being used. Localism is the key here. Local taxes are a good thing as long as they are approved of, democratically by the people who are being taxed.
Yes. Well, that's a fair point. I mean, I think that one of the things that often wrangles with people is that nobody really likes seeing their pay packet diminished by the fact that they do have to pay tax. And of course, there are different levels of tax depending on how much you earn, certainly on a personal scale. Corporate tax, of course, is a different game because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, there are companies who have, sadly, been guilty. And we can mention them because it's been noted in the public arena. The companies like Google and Starbucks, for example, and many others who have actually perhaps sort of taken taken an example where they've held their intellectual property, for example, say in an Irish company that is might be sort of in a tax haven, or which essentially has almost zero tax rate. Effectively, the concept of it is to deliberately not pay as much corporate tax. But I think that the question here is that it's the intent, isn't it? I mean, is that something where the corporate executives have been influenced by an evil force to think we are going to set out to deny people funds? Is that a devilish scheme in itself?
A devilish scheme to deny people funds.
Yes,
so taxation is reducing your spending power.
They've effectively sort of to avoid paying tax, and effectively they're really sort of holding back the funds that could be used by a government, which could be put to good use in, as you say, a local community. This is a tax evasion technique that a lot of companies have actually employed, certainly over the last few decades, and it seems to be getting worse. We hear this concept of tax loophole. Is that a good thing? Well, no, because really there are always loopholes in any system, but surely there's something, an evil force going on here, sort of saying, we don't want to pay tax.
Well, the thing is, whether or not you agree with the taxes that are being levied, if someone is getting away with it by seeing loopholes and then not paying the tax perfectly legally, but they've deliberately avoided it when everyone else has had to pay it.
Yes.
It just seems unfair. So it's then not the rightness of the tax, but the behaviour of the person avoiding the tax. In that they're not doing it out of some point of principle. They're avoiding it because they can get away with it.
Yeah. Well, to that point, I mean, I was going to say that the US government in particular have made a real charter to clamp down on this, and so too indeed has the UK government. And that's not just with corporate companies. Of course, that's individuals who have been guilty of either siphoning funds in bank accounts in Switzerland. But I just thought I'd give a little insight to my thinking on what perhaps many people think about the taxman. So this is a little poem called "The Devil May Care." Dear Mr. Taxman, throughout the years you've acquired tons of tax, a skill for which you have much flair. You've piled the money in lots of packs to account for your great share. So I'd like to reveal some simple facts and lay them out to bear. We weary workers have slogged and broken backs to give you what's fair and square. With loads of loot you've racks of lovely stacks from the dues that we declare. But this process has uncountable attacks on the pauper to the billionaire. Now you've papered over the nation's fiscal cracks since the books were left in disrepair. It's cost us all an arm and a leg with brutal attacks, grasping each pound of flesh that's spare. You've even pinched my fine knick-knacks that your demons did ensnare. Well, you stripped my assets to the very max. Now I no longer have a hope or prayer. There's nothing left to trace my troubled tracks. I'm destined to an infernal nightmare. So we both can go to hell and relax, to a life that's devil may care. Your eponymous, Mr. Anonymous.
Yes, yeah. Well, if only we could be anonymous to the taxman, but famous everywhere else. That would be perfect, wouldn't it? That'd be the cry of every Hollywood star everywhere, I think.
Yes. They might find us in our grand millionaire mansions, but but I think that might be a giveaway. But the point here is that, as I was trying to get across here, is that people slog and slave, the taxman takes, and yet, what happens is eventually you suddenly start to realise, this devil may care approach. At the end of the day, the taxman's always going to get you. He's going to take you right the way through to hell if that's where you're going to go. Because if you choose to go that path, again, not a good path, but eventually you will be caught. And I think that's the point here is that we know that people are influenced by people either who are financial advisors and people that actually earn a living out of deliberately finding schemes to help individuals. I mean, a good example was, and I know they're a favourite group of yours, Take That. I mean, a number of people like Gary Barlow have been guilty of, on their personal level, finding that advisors have managed to advise them, ill-advised, of course, to try and avoid paying tax. Surely this is something that is not just applicable to the UK and the US. This is applicable to all countries. What do they need to do?
That explains actually why I think the longer name for that band is "Don't Take That, It's Mine" instead of "Take That." It's a problem with taxation. If you have taxation which is seen as too high, or it's been levied illegitimately, and those two different gripes with taxation,
yes,
makes many people try and avoid it. If the taxation doesn't appear to be too high, not ridiculously high, and if it seems that it's been spent on reasonable things, so it's not just been taken and used to build mansions for the Prime Minister and that sort of thing, then you're going to get the majority of people, even large companies, paying up. And so this has been supported. This is sort of a theory that I'm putting forward. It is supported by some of the evidence. Now, I mean, I haven't got the evidence right in front of me, so you're going to have to take my word for that. I've seen some evidence that when taxation is put up in the highest tax bracket, people start paying their tax elsewhere. They move their home to somewhere else. And I believe that this is supported by some evidence. And in that case, if that were to happen, because you're talking about high earners, and so people who are paying a lot of tax, you may well not increase the amount of tax you take in at all by increasing taxation. In fact, you might put it down.
Yes.
The overall intake, because you're fighting off the high-income people. Now, not that that's the only decision you can make. You can decide that it's just and fair, that it's paid at a high level. Tax, that is paid at a high level for high earners. But the other thing about whether it's used justly and fairly, I think that's a question of our idea, which we always going on about here at Mark a Beat, of localism, of having decisions on the spending of it made as locally as possible, but also on what it's actually spent on. You've got to spend it on good and fair projects. And I was talking earlier about how in the Bible we saw that taxation was often a taking of money away from people to be spent by a big empire somewhere else. And Jesus confronted this when he was asked by some people who were trying to catch him out whether or not they should pay their tax or not, because the people who were taking the tax were hated and not accountable. And in Matthew 22, verse 17, he's asked, "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." They brought him a denarius, and Jesus says, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's."
Yeah.
Now he's saying, yes, give him the money, but don't give him your loyalty.
No.
And what was happening there is the taxation was being taken, Caesar was taking the money, but in the long run, this was a bad policy, because he had a rebellious people, very rebellious. And after this particular incident, over the 100 or so years after that, there were many, many rebellions in that area.
Yes.
It was a bad policy. The question is, how do you organise it such that taxation is accepted by people?
Well,
if you're going to go down that route, or is there a completely different way of raising revenue?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one, because I'm going to give you two nations that have two totally different policies on tax. One is France. I mean, we always look to France, of course, for extremes. And their particular tax system has been deemed by the French to be excessive. And at least 80% of people from recent surveys think that the current president's economic policy is misguided and inefficient. In fact, famously in recent times, Gérard Depardieu, the actor and director, who is a wealthy person in himself, but clearly has decided that he just had enough and decided to leave the country because he felt that the nation was just too exploitative. But on the contrast, you have countries like Saudi Arabia that actually encourage people to come to the nation and do not have a tax. So on your income, it's effectively a tax-free system. But of course, there are a certain amount of what I'll call business taxes that will be imposed. But essentially, they offer workers and businesses different incentives. But I want to sort of come back to history on this, because it's interesting how people perceive this. Britain, who once had an empire, were very dominant, and particularly also in the United States. So in the 18th century, where Britain had a military presence and a governmental presence. Interestingly, the industrialist Adam Smith in 1776 wrote a piece called The Wealth of Nations. This particular comment that I'm going to read, I think, sort of sets a particular thought, which is every tax, however, is to the person who pays it a badge, not of slavery, but of liberty. Now, the point being is, if you look at it in that way, and what he was saying, it's actually quite interesting that you can take a different viewpoint. Nobody does like paying tax, but in this concept of entrepreneurialism, in the concept of you having a right and you to contributing to society, a wealth of nations, it's interesting that actually is very prevalent today, that is what we are doing. We, as the way we manage our countries, we use that tax, whether that's corporate tax, whether that's individual tax, and whether that's even down to an inheritance tax. There are different forms of taxes. How we use those funds to really enrich our society. So I think that from that point of view, it's a good thing. I think you have to look at tax as a good thing.
Well, tax can be a good thing, but when Adam Smith was writing that, there wasn't any income tax. So he's not talking about income tax. He's talking about levies put on trade.
Yes.
And on industry. So it's different when you start introducing income tax, a widespread income tax.
Yes.
Because you have obviously a depression on actual income.
Yes.
And so, as income is a great motivator to work, you have a depression on how hard people work. Surely it's a bad thing to have income tax paid by so many people. In fact, should it be paid at all? Yes. Well, obviously, if you, gentle listener, if you owe income tax, pay it. I'm not suggesting that we don't pay it because we think, oh, it's a bad thing. I'm not going to do it. I'm saying how we organise the whole country,
yes,
the whole of society. If that were changed such that there was no income tax, would we have a more prosperous country and therefore a better place to live? I would suggest that it could possibly be the case. Certainly, when I was talking about it in biblical times, and Adam Smith, a lot of his principles come from that.
Yes.
And remember, he wasn't talking about income tax. I take his point on tax, which is a point of liberty. You're paying the tax, and you can choose to pay it or not, and then it's a way of funding the whole economic system, because there needs to be some admin, etc., and the country needs to be protected and have armed forces, etc. Yes, that needs to be in place. But he's not talking about income tax. And in the Bible, there wasn't any income tax either.
Yes.
And a lot of his principles came from biblical principles drawn mainly from the Old Testament. How this nation was run in the Old Testament, how Adam Smith is putting forward this idea of how to have a free trade economy, and how Britain in its empire, how America in building up its nation of entrepreneurs, how they developed was initially without income tax. And even though you could say, well, it was during the Napoleonic Wars that Britain introduced income tax. At that time, it was meant to be temporary. Okay, it stayed, but it was also only on a few people.
Yes.
It wasn't everyone being taxed. It only affected a smaller proportion of the population, and they're actually pretty low percentage. The taxation was very low. So it's not. It's been during the latter half of the 20th century onwards that I was about to say just the latter half of the 20th century, as though we were still in it. I was forgetting we were in another one.
Yes.
But anyway, from that time, yes, we're in another one. We have moved on. I am with the times, really. But what I'm saying is that, look, what has happened since then to the world? What's happened since, say, the middle half of the last century, the 20th century? So from the 1930s onwards, what have we seen happen? We've had income tax go up and up, and we've had depression after depression. We've had boom and bust economy, and they too seem to go. They're not the same thing, but it's part of the whole system. You tax people a lot, you then spend that money, then you need to recoup that money, and the whole thing is just a nightmare, which we could see implode.
Yes, well, I do want to sort of not completely defend the governors of our nations in the 21st century, but
I may have been overselling that, listener.
Because I sort of talk about the past just a little bit, just to show where things have gone wrong. Because ironically, there have been throughout history some very strange and unusual weird taxes, and I'm just going to give you a few examples of which, and I'll just invite you to sort of suggest which of these do you think is the silliest. I mean, a good example.
Okay, I've got a good intuition for silliness. So
well, no better a place to start than, of course, England, where, of course,
my sillyometer is already springing into life.
Which, of course, for a period of over 150 years, from 1695, a window tax was levied in England, and this was basically with the result that one could see that there was clearly some problems with this, where buildings even today are bricked up because people just didn't want to pay tax on the windows. At one point, many people liked the concept of having a window because, of course, they didn't have electricity in 1695, so needed light. And, of course, windows provide light. Well, of course, great idea as it might be, it wasn't very popular. And so Britain is littered with buildings where the actual window has actually been bricked up. And of course, a similar thing actually occurred in France.
That is pretty silly, but I knew that one already. But
France took it to another level where there was a tax on hearths, and so effectively, you know, for all those buildings that required a nice fireplace to warm the cockles of your exhausting but chilly day, well, what were the poor French meant to do? Now, to me, this one takes the biscuit, and that was in Tsarist Russia, because there were taxes clamped on beards. And that's genuine. Which to me, I mean, there are.
Now I notice, Mark, that you've shaved your beard off. Is that because you're planning to visit Russia?
Well, I must admit that I have been to many places where beards are very popular, and I do understand there is a trend. I certainly, listeners, I am not sporting a beard, and I am not even an advocate for taxing beards.
No. Well, just to mention here that people want to look back at a previous episode, we did have actually find that God is in favour of beards.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You might want to look at a previous episode.
Yes, I think so. But there is one which I would take you back even further, and do not blame modern society, because during the 1st century AD, Roman Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on urine. Yes. Now, you might think, what on earth was this about? Well, the buyers of urine paid the tax because essentially the urine from public urinals was sold as an essential ingredient for several chemical processes for things like tanning. Now, I think anyone who's a chemist will know that this is quite a common thing in today's society.
Yes.
But, of course, at the time, I know, listeners, we were not there to enjoy this levy. Actually, was a serious tax. So
it was just a wee tax.
It was definitely a wee one. But unfortunately, yes, thank you for that. But unfortunately, we are not guilty in the 21st century of placing silly tax. Now, you could argue that
Really?
the devil has really been around for some time, and I would still come back to this point about, is the taxman the devil in disguise? Well, possibly implementing stupid taxes, but I do understand also that governments are also placed in a very difficult situation. They need money. Societies need roads to be built. They need schools to be funded, hospitals to be funded. Somewhere the tax needs to come. And I do understand what you're saying. Not everybody wants to pay tax. But if you're going to run a modern society, there is only a certain amount of funds that can come from certain levies, trade levies. And I think that, particularly in Britain, where we have a welfare state, you could not remove income tax and still have those benefits. Would you agree?
Oh, I would agree with that. My suggestion, which I was putting forward quite vociferously there. I'm not actually sold on it myself, but I think it's something. The idea of not paying income tax is something that could only be achieved by completely changing the way you do everything. And one of the things that would have to change is you don't have a welfare state. I mean, that's one of the things you would have to change. It's something that I would like to see. I would like to see it happen. But the reason I'm saying I was overselling it, I'm not sold on it, is I don't think it's something that you can work towards by simply incrementally changing something. It would need a complete wholesale change in the way that you think. Because what I'm thinking of is a Christian society.
Yes.
Where things like the welfare state are handled by the church, and that the giving into the church is voluntary, and then that is used for helping people, for funding health care for people who can't afford it. This sort of thing, keeping healthcare free at the point of use, could still be achieved, but through voluntary giving. So it would be a completely different way of living, and couldn't be just put into place now. There's a whole movement, I guess more popular in the United States than here, and possibly, you could argue, more popular in the past than now, called Christian Reconstructionism, which is arguing for a change in society, to change towards being like what I just outlined. I think it needs to be more of a crisis than that. It needs to be a complete change. But they, Christian Reconstructionists would also argue that it needs to be put in along with putting that into place. You need people to be converted into, believing Jesus. They believe in individual conversion as well. They don't just simply believe in change in society. But I would say, I'm not an expert on Christian Reconstructionist movement. Maybe they would agree with this as well. But I would say that the sort of change to a society in which the only major giving to health and to education and those sort of things that which we use a lot of tax on today are voluntary, demands a complete change in the way that everyone thinks, and so it's a conversion of society to Christian and biblical thinking, and so it's not something that I can engineer or anyone can engineer.
No.
So what we're talking about now, in practical terms, now and in the near future, is in terms of how do we better run the society we're already in? How can we make changes? And the only way that I can see that changing is by keeping taxation, but making it fairer, making it more transparent,
yes,
making the tax bands simpler and easier to understand, and making decisions on spending closer to the point of use. In other words, decentralising taxation to a large extent. You could do that because in Britain there's certainly a structure already in place with local councils, etc. Just you'll be giving more power to them, which would make local elections have more importance, and that's even better for democracy, having local elections that really matter. At the moment, in case people don't know, pretty much if you're voting for your local council, what you're voting for is how often the people collect the rubbish bins.
Yes.
There's not that much else that they do. Whereas this would give a whole new importance and relevance to local elections. So I think that it's a win-win situation to decentralise taxation.
Yes. Well, the many economists have different views in terms of how tax can work. But I would invite our listeners to let us know. So listeners, why not drop us a line? Go on to markandpete.com and let us know your thoughts. Do you have a good experience with dealing with a taxman? Do you run a corporate company? Have you got a view on how even corporate tax should be charged in society? So join us again next time for more colourful conversations with Mark and Pete.